They tell you it's all for your benefit. The gates, the rules, the meetings. They say it's about keeping the community clean, safe, and respectable. They promise consistency, peace of mind, and rising property values. That's the illusion. The glossy brochure. The friendly board members with polite smiles and clipboards. But beneath that polished surface lies something else entirely. A machine of quiet control. A system built not just to manage, but to dominate. When you move into an HOA-governed neighborhood, you're not just buying a home. You're signing into a contract, one laced with clauses most homeowners never fully understand. You assume it's routine, just guidelines to keep things orderly. But then it begins, a warning for your trash bins being out a few hours too long, a letter about the shade of your shutters, a fine for a patch of weeds you didn't notice. Small things, petty things. At first, it feels like someone is always watching. Not the police, not your neighbors, but the association, the board, the enforcers of the rules that stretch longer than most small-town legal codes. Rules you didn't write, rules you didn't vote on, and yet rules that govern how high your grass can grow, what kind of plants you can grow, and what holidays you can publicly celebrate. It starts to feel less like a community and more like a controlled environment, one where compliance isn't requested, it's demanded. They frame it as structure, as necessary discipline. But what they rarely tell you is how these rules are interpreted. Selectively, unevenly, and with the full weight of legal authority behind them. These aren't suggestions. These are binding terms. And if you break them, even unintentionally, the consequences can escalate quickly. What begins as a friendly reminder can soon become a certified letter, a lien, a lawsuit, a foreclosure, all over a garden hose or a basketball hoop. What's most alarming is how easy it is to forget that HOAs aren't public institutions. They're private corporations, with power, with lawyers, with budgets drawn from your dues and fines. Their goal isn't always fairness, it's control. Their mission isn't always community, it's conformity. You're told it's about preserving the look and feel of the neighborhood. But who decides what that looks like? Who defines acceptable taste? Who holds the power to say yes or no? HOA boards are often composed of residents themselves. But being your neighbor doesn't mean they're looking out for you. In fact, many boards are ruled by a small handful of individuals who crave power, who thrive on enforcement, and who often run unopposed. They make the rules, they interpret the rules, and they enforce the rules, all from within the same small circle. It's power with no meaningful check and very little accountability. And if you speak up, if you challenge them, you risk becoming a target. Some who speak out are drowned in procedural delays. Others are ostracized. Some are fined into silence. HOAs are sold as guardians of value. But too often, they become guardians of control. They are micro-governments that operate in the shadows, hidden in legalese, shrouded in bureaucracy, and protected by legal precedent. They can seize your property, restrict your speech, and govern your behavior, all without needing to answer to a public vote. Their authority can override your sense of ownership, because in an HOA, you don't fully own your home. You share it with the rules, with the board, with the enforcers who can appear at any moment, measuring your fence or photographing your driveway. This is the illusion they sell, that the HOA is a force for good, that order is safety, that uniformity is peace. But the truth is more unsettling. It's a quiet control, masked as community. And once you're inside, once you've signed those documents, it becomes very hard to escape. Because the gates that promise protection often double as walls. Walls that keep out chaos, but also wall you in. The rules are printed clearly in black and white, nestled inside hundreds of pages of covenants, conditions, and restrictions. To the untrained eye, it looks like formality, dry legalese meant to keep lawns tidy and neighbors agreeable. But once you live under it, you begin to understand that these rules are more than guidelines. They're weapons, tools of silent enforcement, instruments of power that can be wielded with precision or with prejudice. At first, it feels like structure, a gentle nudge. You receive a letter informing you that your garbage cans were visible from the street. Perhaps your grass exceeded the length permitted by the landscaping clause. A warning, then a fine, $50, 100. Small amounts, but they're issued with such confidence, such unwavering authority, that you don't question them. Most don't. You pay and move on, because resisting the system feels like waking a sleeping giant. And that fear, that subtle, quiet fear, is the beginning of the real control. Over time, you start to see the pattern. Some homeowners are fined for a misplaced flower pot, while others can go weeks with overgrown hedges. One family receives a letter over seasonal decorations, while another has their garage door painted an unapproved color for months without consequence. The enforcement is not always equal. It is not always fair. It is filtered through personal preference, through selective attention, and sometimes through bias. In neighborhoods where diversity is growing, this imbalance becomes more visible: who is targeted, who is ignored, and who is quietly pressured to conform. It is in this uneven enforcement that the real danger lies, because it reveals the HOA's role not as a neutral governing body, but as a power structure with its own agendas, its own alliances, and its own sense of order. A structure that often prioritizes aesthetics over people. One that doesn't care about your story, only your compliance. One that views questioning as rebellion and disagreement as disorder. And that's where fear becomes the currency. Fear of penalties. Fear of being singled out. Fear of becoming the next name whispered about in board meetings. Homeowners start self-policing. They mow their lawns early. They measure their fence posts. They remove flags, hide toys, and park precisely within lines. Not out of pride or community spirit, but out of anxiety. They've learned the cost of standing out. They've watched others suffer. A neighbor whose mailbox wasn't regulation height lost thousands in legal battles. Another who hosted gatherings too often received threats of litigation. These aren't horror stories from distant places. They're real, and they're repeated quietly behind closed doors. The rules give the HOA justification. The board doesn't need to dislike you to act against you. All they need is a clause, a page, a sentence. That's the cold beauty of the system. The power is embedded in the paperwork, signed by every homeowner without knowing its full implications. It allows board members, some well-meaning, others not, to act with the force of a court, without the transparency of one. You can be judged, fined, and punished, often without a hearing, often without recourse. The process is rarely public. The decisions are rarely explained, but the impact is deeply personal. In the name of community standards, individuality is erased. A bright door color, a vegetable garden, even a children's play set, anything that disrupts uniformity becomes a target. The HOA becomes the arbiter of taste, the gatekeeper of expression. And when you live under this system long enough, you start to internalize its judgments. You begin to ask permission before you express yourself. You seek approval before you make your house a home. You silence parts of yourself to avoid becoming the problem. What makes it worse is the isolation. Disputes with the HOA often become private struggles. Neighbors fear choosing sides. Friends stay silent. Few want to draw the spotlight. And so you fight alone against a faceless board backed by lawyers, budgets, and years of precedent. The emotional toll is heavy. You begin to second-guess every choice, wondering if your next move will invite another warning, another fee, another confrontation. In a place that was sold to you as a peaceful community, you find yourself navigating a minefield. The rules hang over you, not as guidance, but as threats. And while they may keep the lawns green and the houses uniform, they also keep the people small, careful, compliant. The fines are just the surface. The real cost is what it takes from your voice, your spirit, your sense of freedom in the place you're supposed to call home. It starts with a letter, a small, official-looking envelope tucked into your mailbox or taped to your door. Inside, a notice. You violated a rule, and now you owe a fine, perhaps for a lawn left unmowed, a car parked in the wrong spot, or a fence an inch too high. The amount may seem modest at first, $25, $50, but if you don't pay, if you dispute it, ignore it, or simply don't have the money that week, something darker begins to unfold. A fee becomes a penalty A penalty becomes a lien, and a lien becomes a foreclosure. All from a rule you may not have known you were breaking. What most homeowners don't realize is how swiftly and legally an HOA can take your home. Not through some backdoor tactic, but through a system designed to empower them to do exactly that. Unlike most debts, HOA dues and fines are enforceable in court and, in many states, can trigger foreclosure proceedings even if your mortgage is current. That means you could be up to date with your bank, never miss a utility payment, and still lose your home over a few $100s owed to the association. There's a cruel irony in the way it happens. The HOA that promised to protect your property value can become the very force that destroys it. These aren't abstract possibilities. There are countless stories of homeowners who lost everything over seemingly minor infractions. A garden out of compliance, a misfiled paint request, a missed payment on an annual assessment. The stories are real, and they are devastating. People who believed they were safe behind gated walls discovered just how vulnerable they truly were. This is not a system built on compassion or context. It doesn't ask if you suffered a job loss, faced a medical emergency, or simply forgot to check your mail. It doesn't weigh intent. The rules are rigid, and the financial structure is cold. If you owe, you pay. If you don't, the clock starts ticking. Late fees accumulate, interest is added, legal charges pile up. Before long, the original debt is dwarfed by penalties. What began as a $50 violation can spiral into a bill for thousands. And in that moment, the HOA is no longer your neighbor. It becomes your creditor, your prosecutor, and potentially your auctioneer. These powers are rarely questioned because they are rarely understood. Most homeowners don't read the full extent of the CC and RS when they move in. They don't realize that by signing those documents, they've consented to a financial arrangement where the association has more authority over their property than almost any other entity. And it's not just about money, it's about leverage. The ability to place a lien on your home gives the HOA extraordinary influence. It can freeze your plans to sell. It can damage your credit. It can force your hand. Even more disturbing is how these powers are used. In some communities, HOAs are managed by third-party companies whose income is directly tied to enforcement. These management firms benefit from fees, from legal costs, from fines processed. That means there's a financial incentive to penalize, not resolve. Disputes aren't handled with understanding. They're pushed into collections. Attorneys are brought in. Court filings are prepared. Homeowners are dragged through a process that feels less like justice and more like punishment. Some residents fight back. They spend years in litigation. They drain their savings. They speak out at meetings, organize neighbors, and challenge the system. But fighting an HOA is like fighting a fog. Vague, shifting, and hard to pin down. The documents are written in dense legal language. The procedures are complex. And the boards, often backed by lawyers and liability protections, rarely face real consequences for aggressive tactics. The longer you fight, the more isolated you can become. The community you once trusted becomes silent, or worse, complicit. This isn't about failing to pay what's owed. It's about proportionality, about fairness, about systems that should serve, not threaten. When a homeowner is fined hundreds, then thousands, for infractions that in any other context will be laughably small, we must ask, who is being protected and at what cost? These fines don't always reflect malice or neglect. Sometimes they reflect life, its unpredictability, its complications, its simple human errors. And yet, the response is mechanized, relentless, legal. Behind the tidy streets and pristine homes lies a financial trap few see coming. It's dressed up in professionalism, hidden behind policy, and enforced without mercy. The threat is not chaos outside the gates. It's the quiet power within them, disguised as order, armed with penalties, and ready to strike when you least expect it. In a perfect world, rules would be applied equally. A community would function on the principle that every resident is subject to the same expectations, regardless of who they are or where they live within the neighborhood. But in many HOAs, that's not how it works. Rules are often enforced selectively, not based solely on violations, but on relationships, perceptions, and unspoken hierarchies. What's written in the rulebook is one thing. How it's enforced is something else entirely. You begin to notice it in subtle ways. A neighbor receives a violation for leaving their trash cans out for an extra day. Another does the same thing week after week, but never hears a word. One homeowner is told to remove their seasonal wreath because it's deemed inappropriate, while another has extravagant displays all year long without consequence. A basketball hoop is banned on your driveway, but a few streets over, one has been cemented in for years. You start to realize that enforcement isn't just about the rules. It's about who's watching and who they're watching for. Selective enforcement creates an invisible divide within a neighborhood. Some people live under scrutiny. Others seem to enjoy silent immunity. The reasons can vary. Familiarity with board members, length of residence, personal friendships, racial or cultural biases, even quiet retaliation for speaking out. HOAs aren't immune to prejudice or favoritism, and when power is concentrated in the hands of a few, the rules become less about consistency and more about control. For those on the receiving end, the experience is not just frustrating, it's deeply alienating. It feels personal because it often is. You try to comply, to follow every guideline. You double-check your lawn height, match your paint to the approved color chart, keep your holiday lights within the allowed time frame. And yet, you still receive letters, still get cited, while others, doing the same or worse, are left alone. You begin to feel singled out, targeted. You wonder if it's because you spoke up at the last meeting, or because your background is different, or because someone simply doesn't like you. The emotional toll can be heavy. Living under selective enforcement means living in constant uncertainty. You never know what's going to be flagged next. You can't predict when the next notice will arrive or what it will say. It breeds a kind of quiet anxiety, one that seeps into your daily life. You don't walk outside without scanning your yard for something you might have missed. You question whether to invite people over, worried someone might complain. You hesitate to make even small changes to your home, fearing the consequences. Your house no longer feels like a sanctuary. It feels like a stage being watched by unseen eyes. When you try to raise the issue, the answers are rarely satisfying. The board may claim the complaints are based on reports from neighbors, not personal targeting. They'll say enforcement is handled fairly, that you're imagining the pattern. But you've seen it too many times. You've kept the letters. You've noted the inconsistencies. You've watched others do what you were punished for and walk away untouched. And that's when you understand fairness isn't guaranteed. It's granted, and it's granted selectively. Selective enforcement also corrodes the trust between neighbors. When people see that rules apply unevenly, they start to view each other with suspicion. Some begin reporting minor infractions out of spite, knowing they'll be acted on. Others retreat inward, afraid to draw attention. It breaks down the very sense of community the HOA claims to protect. Because in a truly fair community, everyone is accountable. But in a selectively enforced HOA, power protects itself first and enforces only when convenient or strategic. This dynamic can be especially damaging in diverse communities, where cultural differences or new residents bring fresh perspectives and traditions. What's considered non-compliant is often a matter of taste or tradition. A flag from another country, a different style of landscaping, a family gathering with music. These things are harmless, even beautiful, but can be framed as disruptive when viewed through a biased lens. Selective enforcement becomes a tool not just for order, but for exclusion. Residents who question these disparities are often labeled as troublemakers. Board meetings become hostile. Concerns are dismissed. And slowly, the message becomes clear. Compliance is not about the rule. It's about who you are in relation to the board. That understanding creates silence. A silence that benefits the enforcers and punishes the outliers. You learn to stay quiet, to avoid drawing attention, to live within boundaries that seem to shift depending on who you are and how loudly you speak. In a system where rules are not consistently applied, there is no true justice, only control dressed up as order. Selective enforcement is the crack in the foundation. It is where trust erodes, where fear takes root, and where the promise of fair governance collapses under the weight of personal bias. It reveals not a community, but a hierarchy, not a system of order, but one of quiet oppression. When people hear the word board, they often imagine a group of neighbors sitting around a table, calmly discussing ways to improve the community. They picture volunteers who care, who serve out of goodwill, who make decisions based on fairness and reason. But in many HOAs, the reality looks very different. The board is not always a representative body. It's often a small, tight-knit group that operates behind closed doors, shielded by rules, bureaucracy, and a remarkable amount of unchecked authority. It is called a democracy, but functions more like a private regime. HOA boards are usually made up of residents, but being a neighbor does not make someone benevolent. Some join the board to serve, yes, but others do it for power, for control, for influence over the community and the people in it. These individuals often remain in their positions for years, rarely challenged, often unopposed. Meetings are poorly attended. Elections are barely noticed. By the time most residents realize how much power the board holds, it's too late. The structure has calcified. The hierarchy has solidified, and those in control are firmly entrenched. This concentration of power can lead to a culture of intimidation and silence. The board sets the agenda, interprets the rules, manages the budget, hires the vendors, and issues the fines. They can approve or deny changes to your home. They can decide what counts as a violation. They can determine when, how, and against whom to enforce policies. And unless residents organize and fight back, a slow, complex, and exhausting process, there is very little to stop them. Accountability exists in theory, but in practice, it's minimal. Transparency is often limited to the bare legal minimum, and resistance is quietly discouraged. Residents who question board decisions frequently find themselves at odds with the system. If you raise concerns in a meeting, your comments may be cut short. If you file a complaint, you might be met with procedural delays, vague responses, or complete silence. And if you push too hard, if you challenge authority directly, you risk being labeled a troublemaker, facing retaliation in the form of increased scrutiny or arbitrary enforcement. It becomes clear that cooperation is rewarded and dissent is punished. The board often operates through a web of policies that allow them to act with wide discretion. For example, they may impose new restrictions without a full vote from the community. They may levy fines, approve legal action, or amend budgets with limited oversight. They may enter into contracts with vendors that benefit a few but burden the many. Because they manage the financial resources of the community, collected through dues and assessments, they wield economic power as well. They decide how that money is spent, and sometimes the decisions benefit the board more than the homeowners. This power imbalance is magnified when board members lack the training or temperament to lead responsibly. In some HOAs, board positions are filled by individuals who thrive on control, who enjoy surveillance, and who see their role not as service, but as governance. They take pride in enforcement, in calling out violations, in disciplining neighbors. They attend meetings not to listen, but to dictate. And because the system allows it, they face little pushback. Homeowners often feel too intimidated, too exhausted, or too isolated to confront the board directly. Board meetings, when they are held, often reinforce this dynamic. They can be tightly controlled, with strict agendas and limited time for public comment. Minutes are sometimes vague. Votes are taken quickly. Financials are presented in dense spreadsheets that few understand. The atmosphere can feel less like a neighborhood gathering and more like a bureaucratic tribunal. And if you ask too many questions, if you press for clarity, you may find yourself subtly or overtly shut down. The worst part is that many residents don't realize how much authority the board holds until it impacts them directly, until a permit is denied, until a fine appears in the mail, until a lien is placed on their home. Then they begin to see what others have been warning about, that the board is not just a group of volunteers. It is a power structure, and in many cases, it functions like an internal government but without the democratic safeguards we expect from real governance. There is no separation of powers, no appeals court, no oversight body. Just neighbors, wielding legal authority, often without checks. The danger of this system isn't just in its decisions, it's in its culture. A culture that rewards compliance, discourages transparency, and allows small groups of individuals to dictate how others live. This isn't the spirit of community. It's something else entirely. Something colder. Something that hides behind bylaws and meetings, yet controls your lawn, your mailbox, your front door, your freedom. The HOA board may wear the mask of democracy, but too often it acts with the heart of a quiet dictatorship. Not everyone stays quiet. Not everyone folds under pressure. In nearly every HOA-controlled community, there comes a time when someone pushes back. A homeowner reads the fine print. A neighbor questions the board's authority. A group of residents starts comparing letters, violations, and dues, and realizes they're all experiencing the same quiet oppression. That's when rebellion begins. It doesn't start with shouting. It starts with awareness. And awareness, in an HOA, is a threat to the system. Those who challenge the status quo are often driven not by anger, but by necessity. A mother fined repeatedly for a garden her children planted. A veteran threatened with legal action for flying a flag. A senior citizen drowning in fees for a cracked sidewalk the city refuses to fix. These are not people looking for conflict. They're people trying to live. But when the rules are used as weapons, when the enforcement feels personal, when the fines stack up with no end in sight, resistance becomes survival. The first steps are small. A letter of objection. A polite call to the management company. A request to meet with the board. The answers are cold. The policies are clear. The rules are binding. That's what they're told. So they dig deeper. They look for precedent, for other cases, for state laws that limit the HOA's reach. They attend board meetings. They speak up. Sometimes they're ignored. Sometimes they're mocked. But a few keep going. They document everything. They build a case. And slowly they find others. Rebellion grows in quiet corners, driveway conversations, whispered complaints at the mailbox, late-night emails between frustrated neighbors. One story becomes two. Two become 10. Patterns emerge. The same names. The same fines. The same tactics. A community begins to wake up. They form coalitions. They gather signatures. They run for the board. They file formal complaints. Some hire lawyers. Some call the press. It's not easy. The process is slow, and the system is built to resist change. But the resistance is growing. The board often reacts with tightening control. They limit public comment. They revise meeting rules. They enforce policies with renewed vigor. Critics are labeled disruptive. New violations appear on homes with campaign signs or outspoken residents. The power structure defends itself, not with transparency, but with escalation. And those who stand up feel the pressure. Some lose. They're fined into silence. Their reputations are tarnished. Their neighbors turn away. Not everyone survives the fight, but some do. Some win small battles. They get policies overturned. They expose financial mismanagement. They bring in third-party auditors. They run for election and win. When reformers take the board, the transformation is slow and painful. Old habits don't die easily. The documents are dense. The relationships with vendors are entrenched. But change begins. More meetings are open. More votes are public. Fewer fines are issued. Homeowners start showing up. For the first time, they feel heard. There are also those who walk away, not by choice, but by force. The cost of rebellion is too high. They lose their homes. They're forced into settlements. Their names are removed from records. Their voices are erased from newsletters. Their battles disappear behind legal silence. But their stories remain, in the whispered warnings to new residents, in the scars left behind, in the culture of caution that lives on even after they're gone. Some HOA communities collapse from within. Lawsuits mount. Boards dissolve. Residents demand dissolution or vote to disband. The state steps in. Investigations begin. But these moments are rare. Most HOAs survive, even after public conflict. They adapt. They rebrand. they present a cleaner face. But underneath, the tension remains, the knowledge that power, once abused, never disappears. It simply changes form. Still, the stories of resistance matter. They are evidence that the system is not absolute. That even in communities ruled by rigid policies and powerful boards, the human spirit still stirs. The will to question, the courage to confront, the refusal to accept control disguised as order. These are the sparks that keep freedom alive, even behind the gates. In every neighborhood ruled by an HOA, there's a tension between order and autonomy. Most residents will comply. Some will grumble. A few will fight. And those few, whether they win, lose, or walk away, leave behind a legacy. They remind the rest of us that this isn't just about paint colors or lawn heights. It's about the right to live without fear, to speak without punishment, to call a place home without needing permission from those who claim to protect it.